The sun was an anvil, and the world was a piece of iron being hammered flat. It beat down upon the valley, bleaching the sky to a hazy, pale sheet and baking the earth into a mosaic of cracks that mirrored the lines on the workers' faces. Dust, stirred by a wind that offered no relief, settled like a shroud on everything, on the drooping leaves of the sparse cottonwood trees, on the sweat-stained shoulders of the laborers, and on the quiet figure of Mei Lin. She moved with a rhythm born of endless repetition, her body a testament to a will that had long since outlasted hope. Her brown prairie dress, patched and faded, was dark with perspiration at the small of her back and beneath her arms. Each time she bent to pull a stubborn root from the unforgiving soil, the muscles in her back corded, a map of her struggle drawn beneath the thin fabric. Her hands, though calloused and stained, were deft and certain, her movements economical. There was no wasted energy, for there was none to spare. Around her, others toiled in the same oppressive silence, a community of ghosts bound by the invisible chains of debt and desperation to this land, this personal fiefdom of Jedediah Thorne. They kept their heads down, their eyes on the dirt, their spirits worn as thin as their shoes. Into this tableau of quiet suffering, a rider appeared. He was a silhouette against the blinding glare of the horizon at first, a slow-moving disruption in the monotonous landscape. As he drew closer, details emerged from the heat shimmer. He was tall, his frame lean but solid, wrapped in dusty, functional clothes that had seen hard miles. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face, but it couldn't hide the set of his jaw, a line of pure granite. He rode not with the swagger of a gunslinger looking for trouble, but with the weary patience of a man who had seen too much of it. His horse, a sturdy roan, picked its way through the ruts of the main track leading to the Thorne Ranch with the same unhurried competence as its rider. He dismounted near the foreman's shack, his movements fluid and deliberate. His gaze swept over the fields, over the bent backs of the workers, and for a moment, it lingered on Mei Lin. He saw not just a laborer, but the defiant tilt of her chin as she straightened to wipe a bead of sweat from her brow, the unyielding strength in her eyes that the sun could not bake out. His name was Silas, and in the profound quiet of his observation, a single stone had been dropped into the stagnant pond of this valley. The ripples had already begun. Silas took a job digging irrigation ditches, work that was brutal and thankless but put him in the orbit of the fields. It was a position no one else wanted, a back-breaking task under the same merciless sun, but it offered him a vantage point. From the trench, waist-deep in the earth he was meant to tame, he could observe the brutal ecosystem of the Thorne Ranch. He saw Elias Vance, the foreman, a man whose authority was worn like a cheap suit, ill-fitting and reeking of insecurity. Vance moved among the workers with a coiled, serpentine energy, his voice a low hiss of insults and threats. He was Thorne's dog, and he enjoyed the biting. Silas watched as Vance deliberately kicked over a bucket of water left in the shade for a gasping, elderly worker, sneering as the precious liquid vanished into the thirsty dust. The old man said nothing, merely closed his eyes for a moment before retrieving the empty bucket. The other workers shifted their gaze, their complicity a tangible weight in the thick air. Fear was the true crop being cultivated here. Silas's attention, however, always returned to Mei Lin. He saw how she carried herself with a guarded dignity that infuriated Vance. The foreman would assign her the most difficult rows, the rockiest soil, yet she met each challenge with a silent, dogged determination that seemed to deny him his satisfaction. One afternoon, as the sun reached its zenith, Silas saw her falter. She swayed on her feet, her hand going to her temple. He watched, his own hands tightening on the handle of his shovel, his knuckles white. Before Vance could notice, Silas climbed from his ditch, retrieved his own canteen from his saddle, and walked over to her. He didn't speak. He simply uncorked it and held it out. Mei Lin stared at the canteen, then at him. Her eyes, dark and deep, were filled with a suspicion that was older and more profound than mere caution. She saw the man, the stranger, and the danger he represented by this simple act of kindness. An act like this was a loose thread that Vance, or worse, thorn, would pull until everything unraveled. For a long moment, she did not move. The other workers pretended not to see, their backs turned, their movements suddenly more vigorous. Finally, her gaze flickered towards Vance, who was berating another worker at the far end of the field. She took the canteen, her small, rough hand brushing against his. She drank, just 2 short, quick swallows, and handed it back. "Yeah," she whispered, the words a soft exhalation, almost lost in the oppressive heat. "Thank you," Silas simply nodded, his expression unreadable, and walked back to his trench. He had not offered charity. He had offered respect. And in that desolate field, respect was a more dangerous currency than gold. The next day, the air was thicker, heavier, charged with an unspoken tension. Vance had seen the exchange, or someone had reported it to him. His eyes were fixed on Silas and Mei Lin, a predatory gleam promising retribution. The opportunity came in the form of a wagon loaded with sacks of seed, its wheel broken a quarter-mile from the main barn. It was a man's job, a job for 2 men, but Vance's cruelty had a theatrical flair. He strode over to Mei Lin, a smug twist to his lips. "You!" he barked, pointing a thick finger at her. "The wagon needs unloading. Get those sacks to the barn." A collective, silent gasp went through the nearby workers. Each sack weighed nearly 100 pounds. It was not a task. It was a punishment designed to break her. Mei Lin looked at the wagon, then back at Vance, her face a mask of stoicism. She did not argue or plead. To do so would be to give him the satisfaction he craved. She simply nodded and began the long walk towards the broken wagon, her steps steady, her back straight. Silas watched her go, his jaw tightening until a muscle leaped along its edge. He laid his shovel aside, the clang of metal on rock startlingly loud in the sudden silence. He began to walk, his long strides easily catching up to her. He fell into step beside her, his presence a silent declaration. She glanced at him, a flicker of something, fear, confusion, perhaps annoyance, in her eyes. This was her fight, her burden to carry. His interference put them both in greater peril. They reached the wagon. Mei Lin reached for the first sack, her small frame bracing for the immense weight. She managed to hoist it, her knees buckling slightly, a soft grunt escaping her lips. She took a staggering step, then another. The barn seemed a mile away. It was then that Silas moved in front of her, blocking her path. His shadow fell over her, a momentary eclipse of the brutal sun. His voice was low, calm, yet it carried across the field like a crack of thunder. "Let me carry that load." It was not a question. It was a statement, a quiet, unyielding challenge to the entire world they inhabited. Mei Lin froze, the weight of the sack pressing down on her, her breath caught in her throat. She stared up at him, at this stranger who spoke in short, simple sentences that overturned her entire understanding of survival. Survival here meant being invisible. He was making them the center of everything. Behind them, Elias Vance began to stride towards them, his face darkening into a mask of pure rage. The show had just begun. Vance reached them with the coiled fury of a stepped-on rattlesnake. His face flushed a mottled red beneath his sweat-stained hat. His hand went instinctively to the handle of the whip coiled at his belt, a tool he used for livestock and, on occasion, for people who forgot their place. "What do you think you're doing, Drifter?" he spat. His eyes locked on Silas, deliberately ignoring Mei Lin as if she were a piece of furniture. "I gave the woman an order." Silas didn't flinch. He gently took the heavy sack from Mei Lin's shoulders, setting it on the ground with an ease that belied its weight. He turned his full attention to the foreman, his gaze level and cold. "The work will get done," Silas stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. It wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was a simple fact. This calm defiance was more infuriating to Vance than any outright challenge would have been. It was like punching water. "I give the orders here," Vance hissed, stepping closer, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate. He was a bull of a man, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, but Silas stood his ground, rooted to the earth. You'll do the job you're paid for, and the woman will do the job she's told from the porch of the main ranch house. Another figure watched the unfolding drama. Jedediah Thorne, the owner of this vast expanse of misery, leaned against a pillar, smoking a thin cigar. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed absurdly out of place in the dust and heat. A cold, amused smile played on his lips. He saw the confrontation not as a breakdown in discipline, but as a diverting bit of sport. He was curious to see how his dog would handle this stray. Back at the wagon, Silas's eyes narrowed slightly. "She can't carry this load. I can," he said, the words simple and direct. "The sacks will be in the barn." He then bent down, and with a single powerful movement, heaved a sack onto each shoulder. He straightened up, carrying 200 pounds as if it were a minor inconvenience, and began walking towards the barn, leaving Vance sputtering in his wake. The foreman, utterly humiliated, looked from Silas's retreating back to Mei Lin, who stood frozen. He took a menacing step towards her, his hand twitching, but a sharp whistle from the porch stopped him. Thorne gestured with his cigar, a flick of the wrist that was an undeniable command. "Let it go. For now." The show was over. Vance shot Mei Lin a look of pure venom before turning and stomping away. Later that evening, in the dim twilight, Mei Lin found Silas by the water trough, washing the grime from his face and hands. She said nothing, but approached and held out a small, clean strip of cloth. He looked down and saw a long, shallow cut on his forearm, scraped raw from the rough burlap of the sacks. He hadn't even noticed. He looked at her offering, and saw the unspoken gratitude mixed with a deep, profound fear of what he had set in motion. He took the cloth and gently wrapped his arm, their fingers brushing for a second time. The connection was brief, but in the growing darkness, it felt like a single, flickering candle in an overwhelming void. The days that followed settled into a new, tense rhythm. A silent understanding now existed between Silas and Mei Lin, a fragile alliance forged in a moment of defiance. It was a language spoken not with words, but with actions. When Silas saw that the roof of Mei Lin's small, dilapidated shack had a leak, he spent his evening meal break patching it with scavenged planks and tar. He didn't ask, he just did it. The next morning, he found a small bowl of congee, warm and savory, left on a crate near his ditch. It was more than she could afford to spare, a gesture of profound sacrifice. Their communication was a series of these quiet kindnesses, each one a thread being woven into a bond that was both a comfort and a target. They worked, as always, under the watchful, hateful gaze of Elias Vance, who now seemed to be waiting for an excuse, any excuse, to unleash the violence he had been denied. But the greater danger came from the main house. Jedediah Thorne's idle amusement had curdled into a specific predatory interest. He had seen Silas's quiet strength and Mei Lin's resilient pride, and he viewed their unspoken connection as a personal affront. He began to make his presence known. He would ride his magnificent black stallion past the fields where Mei Lin worked, his eyes lingering on her, stripping her of her dignity with a single proprietary glance. He started directing comments to Vance, loud enough for her to hear. "That one's got spirit," he'd drawl, smoke curling from his lips. "I like spirit." It's a fine thing to break. The other workers, already wary, now treated Silas and Mei Lin like they carried a plague. They would create a wide berth around them in the fields. Conversations would halt if they drew near, and no one would meet their eyes. The isolation was suffocating, pressing in on them from all sides. They were two solitary figures in a landscape of fear. One afternoon, as Mei Lin was tending a small, hidden patch of sunflowers she had cultivated behind her shack, a secret rebellion of beauty in the pervasive ugliness, Thorne approached her directly for the first time. Silas was 100 yards away, digging, but he saw it all. He saw Thorne dismount, his movements slow and deliberate, like a cat approaching a bird. He saw the way Mei Lin stood up, her back ramrod straight, her hands clutching a small trowel. He couldn't hear the words, but he saw Thorne's leering smile, the way he reached out to touch a strand of her dark hair. He saw her flinch away as if struck by a hot iron. Silas's hands clenched the handle of his shovel so tightly it felt as if the wood might splinter. Every instinct screamed at him to close the distance, to intervene. But he knew that was what Thorn wanted. The landowner was setting a trap, and the bait was Mei Lin's honor. The confrontation was coming. It was no longer a matter of if, but when, and it would not be settled with sacks of grain. That evening, the air hung heavy and still, pregnant with the coming storm. Silas found Mei Lin not at her shack, but sitting by the dry creek bed, her gaze fixed on the bruised purple of the twilight sky. The sunflowers she tended stood behind her, their heavy heads bowed in the fading light as if in prayer. She didn't look up as he approached, but her posture softened almost imperceptibly. He sat a respectful distance away, the silence between them no longer a void but a space they shared. After a long while he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "He's a man who takes what he wants." It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of the fear she was living with. She finally turned to him, her eyes reflecting the last vestiges of daylight. "I am not a thing to be taken." Her voice was quiet, yet it held the unyielding hardness of river stone. It was in that moment that he saw the full depth of her strength, a resilience that had not been gifted to her but forged in the fires of a life he couldn't imagine. He saw the scars on her hands, the weariness in her shoulders, and the unbreakable core of her spirit. He felt a pull towards her that was more than protectiveness, more than admiration. It was a recognition of a kindred soul, a fellow survivor who refused to be defined by the harshness of her world. He moved closer, his own calloused hand resting on the cracked earth between them. "I know," he said softly. He wanted to tell her about the life he'd left behind, the dust and smoke of a past he was trying to outrun, a past that had taught him how to recognize predators like Thorn. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply asked, "Why sunflowers?" A small, rare smile touched her lips, a fleeting expression of profound beauty. "They follow the sun," she whispered. "Even on the darkest days, they know where to find the light." In her simple words, he found the answer to a question he hadn't known he was asking. She was not looking for a savior. She was looking for the sun. He reached out, his fingers hesitating for a moment before gently brushing a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was an act of startling intimacy, a touch that conveyed more than 1,000 words of comfort. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch for a fraction of a second, her eyes closing. In that shared stillness, in the middle of a world owned by a cruel man, a fragile and powerful love began to take root. The very next evening, the trap was sprung. The air had cooled, but a suffocating tension remained. As Mei Lin lit the single candle in her small shack, a heavy, brutal knock fell upon the flimsy door. It was Vance, his silhouette blocking the doorway, his presence filling the tiny space with a sense of greasy menace. He didn't bother with pleasantries. His eyes roamed over her with contemptuous ownership. "Mr. Thorn requires your presence," he said, his voice a low growl. "At the main house. He wishes to discuss your continued employment." The euphemism was so thin it was transparent, an insult wrapped in the thinnest veneer of civility. "He expects you to make yourself presentable." Mei Lin stood perfectly still, the candlelight flickering in her dark, unblinking eyes. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. But her face remained a mask of calm defiance. She said nothing. Her silence was her last remaining shield, a refusal to participate in her own degradation. Vance's lip curled into a sneer. He enjoyed this, the breaking of spirits. "Don't be late," he added, his gaze dropping meaningfully before he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the scent of stale whiskey and cruelty hanging in the air. For a long moment, Mei Lin did not move. The world had narrowed to this single, squalid room and the impossible choice before her. She could obey, and a part of her would die. She could refuse, and the consequences would be swift and brutal. She walked over to the small crate where she kept her few possessions. Her fingers closed around the small, sharp trowel she used for her sunflowers. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was hers. Just as her hand tightened around it, a shadow fell across the doorway again. It was Silas. He had been waiting, watching. He knew Vance's visit was an inevitability. He stepped inside, his presence a comforting bulwark against the fear that threatened to consume her. He looked at her face, saw the unshed tears of rage and despair glittering in her eyes, and then his gaze fell to the trowel clutched in her hand. His expression softened with a deep, aching tenderness. He did not tell her what to do, did not make promises of rescue. He simply stood before her, a quiet mountain of a man, and asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want to do, Mei Lin?" She looked up at him, and in his steady gaze, she did not see pity. She saw respect. She saw a partner. The tears finally fell, but her voice when she spoke was clear and strong. "I want to live." Silas gave a single, slow nod. "Then we leave," he said. "But first, I have a debt to settle." He turned and walked out into the night, his steps purposeful. He was not walking towards the open plains and freedom, but towards the main house, a looming citadel of light and corruption on the hill. Mei Lin watched him go, her heart a storm of terror and hope. Inside the house, Jedediah Thorne was enjoying a glass of brandy. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, the picture of refined authority. His wife, Beatrice, a woman with a face as cold and brittle as fine china, sat opposite him, embroidering. Elias Vance stood near the door, shifting his weight, eager for the night's entertainment to arrive. The heavy oak doors swung open, and it was not Mei Lin who stood there, but Silas. His face was calm, his hands empty at his sides, but he carried an aura of finality that silenced the room. Thorne raised an eyebrow, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. "You are not who I sent for," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The help is not permitted in the main house." Silas took a step into the room, his eyes never leaving Thorne. "She is not coming," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "Her employment is terminated." A slow, ugly smile spread across Thorne's face. He set his brandy down. "Is that so? Vance, it seems the stray needs to be put down. Be quick about it. I don't want a mess on the rug." Vance grinned, his hand dropping to the pistol holstered at his hip. He was fast, but Silas was a different order of being. In a motion that was a fluid, impossible blur, Silas drew the Colt Peacemaker that had been hidden beneath his jacket. Before Vance's gun had even cleared leather, a single, deafening shot echoed through the opulent room. Vance staggered back, a look of pure shock on his face, a dark hole blossoming in the center of his chest. He crumpled to the floor, a discarded puppet. Beatrice Thorne let out a small, sharp gasp, her needle freezing in midair. Thorne's arrogant smile vanished, replaced by a mask of disbelief and fear. He scrambled for a pistol hidden in his desk drawer, but Silas was already moving, covering the distance in 3 long strides. He kicked the desk drawer shut, splintering the wood and trapping Thorne's hand. Thorne howled in pain and rage. Silas leaned in close, his voice a low, chilling whisper. "You built your kingdom on the backs of broken people. You take and you take. Tonight you pay." He did not kill Thorne. He did something far more devastating. He broke the man's power, his authority, his illusion of control, leaving him a whimpering, pathetic creature in his own palace of greed. With a final look of contempt, Silas turned his back on the ruined tyrant and walked out, leaving the cold silence of the great house to be filled only by the quiet, rhythmic sobs of a man who had just lost everything. Silas returned to Mei Lin's shack. The single gunshot had been a clear, terrifying bell tolling across the valley. He found her standing outside, a small bundle of her belongings at her feet. In her hands, she clutched a small cloth pouch. She looked at him, her eyes wide with questions she was afraid to ask. "It's done," he said simply. "We have to go." Now there was no time to waste. They saddled his horse, the roan standing patient in the darkness. He swung himself up, then reached down for her. She took his hand, and he easily pulled her up to sit in front of him. Her small bundle was tied to the saddle horn. As the horse began to move, walking quietly away from the lights of the ranch. Mei Lin looked back one last time at the fields where she had poured so much of her life into the dust. She felt not sorrow, but a profound, soaring sense of release. They rode through the night, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the life they were leaving behind. The moon was a silver guide, casting long shadows that danced around them. For hours, they did not speak, the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves the only sound. As the first hint of dawn began to soften the eastern sky, they stopped by a small, clear stream to rest the horse and themselves. Silas dismounted, then gently lifted her down. Her legs were stiff, and she stumbled, but he caught her, his hands steady on her waist. For a moment, they simply stood there, bathed in the pale light of a new day. He looked down at her, at the strength in her face, the resilience in her eyes. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded, a genuine smile finally reaching her eyes. "I am free," she whispered. It was a word she had never truly understood before. She opened the small cloth pouch she had been holding so tightly. Inside were dozens of dried sunflower seeds. She held them out on her palm for him to see. "For where we are going," she explained. He covered her hand with his own, his large, calloused fingers closing gently over hers and the seeds of their future. It was a silent promise, a pact to build, not just to run. In the quiet wilderness, with the world they had known in ruins behind them, they were finally, truly together. They traveled for 2 years, moving through landscapes that slowly washed the dust of the Thorn Valley from their souls. They worked odd jobs, saved every penny, and kept moving, looking for a place that felt like a beginning. They found it in a high mountain valley, a small, unclaimed plot of land with rich soil and a creek that ran year-round. It was hard. The work was more demanding than anything they had ever known, but it was a joyful labor. Every stone they cleared from the field, every log they shaped for their cabin, was an act of creation. They were not working for a master. They were building a life. Silas, the stoic gunslinger, proved to have a gentle hand with carpentry and planting. Mei Lin, who had only ever known how to coax life from tired, depleted soil, discovered a deep, innate wisdom for cultivation. She planted her sunflower seeds in a circle around the small cabin they built with their own hands. The first year, the flowers grew tall and strong, their bright, defiant faces turning in unison to follow the sun across the sky. They were a fortress of hope, a vibrant declaration of their survival. Their love, born in silence and shared struggle, blossomed in this peaceful solitude. It was in the way he would bring her a cool cup of water without her asking, the way she would mend a tear in his shirt before he noticed it. It was in the shared meals at the simple wooden table he had built, and the comfortable silence as they watched the stars blanket their valley at night. There was no grand passion, but a deep, abiding partnership that was more powerful than any fleeting romance. They had carried each other's loads, and in doing so, had found a strength they never knew they possessed. Their world was small, but it was entirely their own, built not on the currency of power and fear, but on the simple, profound foundations of respect and love. And so the story ends but also begins. It serves as a reminder that the deepest forms of courage are often the quietest. It is a testament to the fact that true strength is not wielded like a weapon to control others, but like a shovel to cultivate a place of peace. Look around at the world, at the struggles faced by those with quiet dignity, and ask yourself a simple question. When you see a burden that is too heavy for one person to bear, do you turn away, or do you find the strength to say, "Let me carry that load"?